Leonard Leo Harrington was the kind of man who never heard the word no. As the founder and CEO of Vanguard Ventures, he was used to private jets, five-star hotels, and staff who took care of life's inconveniences. Yet here he was, alone in a sleek black sports car, cruising down a quiet highway that stretched across the California desert. He hadn't planned on driving. Normally, he'd fly. But after back-to-back meetings that left him feeling suffocated, he canceled the jet and decided on a solo road trip to clear his head. He wanted silence, time to think about the latest acquisition and whether he still found purpose in chasing endless deals. He never expected his entire life would change at mile marker 76. Late in the afternoon, the sun blazed overhead, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. That's when he saw a lone figure on the side of the road, waving timidly by a dusty sedan with the hood popped open. Leo considered passing by. He didn't have time for roadside rescues. But something in the woman's expression drew him in. He pulled onto the shoulder and hopped out, his Italian loafers crunching on gravel. "Car trouble?" he asked in a measured tone. The woman looked up, relief crossing her face. She was dressed in cut-off jeans and a faded college t-shirt, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail. "Yeah, overheated, I think," she said. "I'm Grace. Grace Townsend." "Leo," he replied simply, choosing not to give his last name. "Let's see if I can help." Together, they fiddled under the hood, but it was obvious the car needed a mechanic. Grace sighed heavily, rummaging through her phone. "No service," she muttered. Leo glanced at the empty desert around them. The next town was at least 30 miles away. "Get your stuff," he offered. "I'll give you a ride." She paused, uncertain. "Are you sure? I can wait for a tow truck." "It could take hours for a truck to even pass by here." His tone was calm but firm. "Hop in. I'll drop you off wherever you need to go." Something about his unwavering confidence made her nod. She gathered her small suitcase and locked the useless sedan. The moment she settled into the leather passenger seat, an odd sense of comfort washed over her. Back on the road, the atmosphere inside the car was tense at first. Grace fidgeted with the air conditioning vents. Leo watched her from the corner of his eye, aware that she seemed both grateful and guarded. After a few miles of silence, he finally spoke. "Where are you headed?" She exhaled, as if relieved he'd broken the ice. "Heading to Oakdale. My best friend's birthday is tomorrow. I promised I'd be there." Leo glanced at the GPS on the dashboard. Oakdale wasn't too far off his route, just an hour's detour. "I can take you," he said. "No problem." Grace shot him a sidelong look. "I don't want to pull you away from wherever you're going." "Plans are flexible," he replied. She studied his profile for a moment. He was obviously wealthy, the high-end car, the custom suit jacket hanging in the back seat. Yet he was polite, no arrogance in his tone. "Thanks," she said softly. "I really appreciate this. Today's been a mess." Leo glanced at her again. "Bad day?" Grace laughed wryly. "Bad year. I lost my job a few months back, then the rent on my apartment went up. I've been between gigs, trying to land something steady." He nodded, not entirely sure how to respond. The problems of everyday people rarely crossed his path. He was used to dealing in billions, not budgeting for rent. Still, something in her voice tugged at him. She wasn't complaining. She was just tired. "And you?" she asked, turning the tables. "What do you do?" "Investments," he replied curtly, hoping that would be vague enough. She blinked. "Stocks, banking, that kind of thing?" "Something like that," he said, ending the conversation there. He didn't want to mention the Harrington name. Not yet. They drove for another hour in relative quiet, the desert scenery giving way to rolling hills. Suddenly, the sports car's dashboard lit up with an alert. "Low tire pressure." Leo swore under his breath. "Looks like we need to stop. There's a service station up ahead." They pulled into a small, family-run gas station. It was the kind of old-fashioned place with a single garage door and a faded sign. The mechanic inspected the tire and shook his head. "You picked up a nail, mister. I can patch it, but I'd suggest staying the night somewhere close by. Tire's got a set, and it's almost closing time." Leo frowned, unaccustomed to being inconvenienced. Grace, standing beside him, glanced at her phone again. "Any hotels around?" The mechanic scratched his head. "There's a motel about 5 miles up the highway. Not fancy, but it's clean." Leo turned to Grace. "We'll stay there tonight, then head out in the morning once the tire's fixed." She hesitated. "You're really okay with that?" He sighed, slipping his credit card to the mechanic. "I don't see another option. Let's call it an adventure." The motel was as modest as the mechanic had promised. A row of doors, flickering neon sign, and a tiny lobby that smelled faintly of stale coffee. The receptionist squinted at them like he rarely saw new customers. "2 rooms?" he asked. Leo nodded immediately. "Yes, 2 rooms." Grace almost laughed at how quickly he answered. At least he's not assuming we'd share, she thought. Within minutes, the receptionist handed over 2 identical brass keys on plastic keychains. Grace's room was small but tidy, a single bed, a nightstand, and a rattling air conditioner. She tossed her suitcase down and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion creeping over her. What a day, from a broken-down car to a random road trip with a mysterious investor. A soft knock on her door startled her. She opened it to find Leo, holding a paper bag. "The diner down the road was about to close," he said. "Grabbed us some food." She let him in, a bit shy now that they were alone in the cramped space. Setting the bag on a tiny table, he pulled out 2 styrofoam containers. Burgers and fries, nothing fancy. They ate mostly in silence, the hum of the old air conditioner filling the gap. Every so often they glanced at each other. There was a charged undercurrent, a sense that both had more to say, but were too guarded to say it. Eventually, Leo stood. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll head out first thing in the morning." Grace nodded. "Thank you for everything, seriously." He paused at the door, a faint, almost vulnerable smile touching his lips. "Sleep well." She didn't realize how warm her cheeks felt until after the door clicked shut. Morning came with a soft glow seeping through the thin curtains. Grace walked to the motel's tiny lobby, enticed by the smell of fresh coffee. She found Leo already there, stirring sugar into a paper cup. "Morning," she said, suddenly nervous. He offered her a cup without a word, then nodded toward a pair of threadbare chairs by the window. They sat, sipping in silence before he finally spoke. "I called the garage," he said quietly. "Tires patched. We can leave whenever you're ready." "Right," Grace said, trying to quell the disappointment in her stomach. Soon, they'd part ways. He'd return to his world of high finance, and she'd be back to job hunting. As if sensing her thoughts, Leo looked at her. "What happens when you get to Oakdale?" She shrugged. "I'll celebrate my friend's birthday. Then, who knows? One day at a time, I guess." He studied the swirl of coffee in his cup. "Not much of a plan." "Not all of us can plan out our entire lives," she replied, a little more sharply than she meant. But instead of irritation, he just nodded, as though he understood something unspoken. They retrieved the sports car and drove the final stretch to Oakdale. As they entered the small town, pastel balloons and signs pointed to the local community center, where Grace's friend was hosting a birthday bash. Streamers and music gave the place a festive vibe. Grace led Leo inside, feeling oddly self-conscious. A handful of her friends greeted her excitedly. She introduced Leo as a friend who helped me out of a jam. One friend, a local banker, did a double take. "Harrington? As in Harrington, the friend asked, wide-eyed. Leo's jaw set. He offered a polite nod but said nothing, yet the friend gawked. "You? You're the CEO of Vanguard Ventures. You're practically—" Grace's eyes widened. She turned to Leo, her heart pounding. "Is that true?" He sighed, quietly pulling her aside from the rest of the group. "Yes, Leonard Harrington. Billionaire, investor, all of it. I didn't mention it because I didn't want that to color our interactions." She stared at him, mind reeling. Of course she'd suspected he had money. He was polished, confident. But an actual billionaire? That level of wealth felt unreal. Grace swallowed. "Okay," she whispered. "I just didn't expect that." Leo's expression flickered with concern. "Does it change anything?" She had no idea how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted. He nodded once, stepping back. "I'll give you space. Enjoy your friend's birthday." An hour later, the party was in full swing. Lively music, laughter, and a makeshift dance floor under twinkling string lights. But Grace felt distracted, her gaze drifting to where Leo leaned against a wall, politely conversing with a small circle of curious guests. Finally, unable to ignore the pull any longer, she walked over to him. He turned, eyes filled with quiet tension. "Grace." She cut him off, grabbing his hand. "Dance with me?" Surprise flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. She led him to the floor, the music shifting to a soft, romantic tune. The moment his hand settled on her waist, an electric jolt spread through her. She could feel the curious stares of her friends, but she blocked them out. "I'm sorry if I overreacted," she said quietly. "It's just a lot to process." He exhaled, relief evident. "I should have told you, but I like that you didn't treat me like some powerful figure. You just saw me." They swayed gently, their bodies inches apart. Warmth blossomed in her chest. "Well, right now I'm just seeing a man who rescued me from a stranded car, not some billionaire mogul." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That's all I ever wanted." The overhead lights caught the sincerity in his eyes, and Grace felt a flutter of hope. The music ended, and for a moment they simply stood there, gazes locked. Then a round of applause and playful whoops erupted from the guests, snapping them back to reality. They left the dance floor together, tension replaced by a comfortable awareness. But as the night wound down, Leo glanced at his phone. Work notifications, a text from his personal assistant about an urgent merger negotiation. He set the phone aside, jaw tense. "I have to head back to Los Angeles tomorrow morning," he said. "Meetings I can't reschedule." Grace nodded. "Of course, that's your life." He hesitated, searching her face. "Come with me." Her heart lurched. "Leo, I'm serious." He reached for her hand. "There's plenty of room in my world for you." She almost laughed, tears threatening to sting her eyes. "I don't fit in with that crowd. I don't have a job right now. He squeezed her hand. "Don't say no. Just think about it." By midnight, the party ended. Guests drifted home, and Grace helped tidy up the community center, forcing herself to keep busy. Leo waited by the exit, his coat draped over one arm, posture unusually tense. When she finally walked toward him, her steps felt heavier than they should. "I'll see you off in the morning," she managed. He inclined his head. "All right." Back outside, he paused by his car. The headlights illuminated the dusty parking lot. For a moment, the night air crackled with words unsaid. "I'll be at the Oakdale Inn," he said. "Room 204 if you change your mind." She nodded, tears welling up at the corners of her eyes. He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then, without another word, he slipped behind the wheel and drove off into the darkness. Back in her friend's spare bedroom, Grace tried to sleep, but her thoughts raced. Her heart warred with her head. She barely knew Leo. They'd spent 2 days together. Yet no man had ever made her feel so seen, and he treated her as if her presence mattered far more than any deal. By dawn, she had her answer. She found herself at the Oakdale Inn just as the sun peeked over the horizon, turning the sky a soft pink. The parking lot was nearly empty, and with every step toward room 204, her pulse pounded harder. Her knock was tentative. After a heartbeat, the door opened. Leo stood there, suitcase by his feet, about to leave. Surprise, then hope, flickered in his gaze. "You came," he murmured, voice rough with uncertainty. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I don't want to say goodbye. Not yet." A month later, Grace found herself living in an airy, sunlit apartment in Los Angeles. Leo had insisted on helping her find a place that suited her style. Something close to the city's energy, yet cozy enough to feel like home. She'd finally landed a new job as a freelance designer, and her life had taken a 180 turn. They still had their differences. She teased him for over-planning everything, and he showed her that trusting someone wasn't as scary as she thought. But each step they took, together, felt natural, right? One crisp morning, Leo invited her to join him on the terrace of his penthouse. The skyline stretched out in front of them, a testament to all he'd built. She sipped coffee, content, until he turned to her with an intensity in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Grace," he said softly, "I still don't do anything halfway. When I want something, I go all in." She smiled, nerves dancing in her stomach. "I'm learning that about you." He reached into his pocket, and her breath caught in her throat. In a small velvet box was a delicate ring that sparkled in the morning sun. Her heart hammered as he took her hand. "I know this is fast, but I'm certain. Will you keep walking this road with me, wherever it leads?" Tears blurred her vision. She didn't hesitate. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she rose on tiptoe to kiss him, knowing, deep down, that their story was just beginning.